Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Thank you, Jason. Good to be on.
So, Chuck, you spent years as a Navy SEAL Team 6 squadron leader, but you also worked in American intelligence globally. So, let me ask you a question. What do you see today when many in Washington, D.C. say that we should be making allies with Russia? In fact, Russia is interested in being our friend. Do you believe that?
No, I actually don't. Uh, a great deal of my early career I spent engaging in transnational counterterrorism operations in Europe with a variety of what purported to be indigenous leftist organizations. Bader Meinhof, the Red Army faction, the Red Brigades. These were terrorist organizations back in the big hair days that were involved in aircraft hijacking, the assassination of Italian politicians, the kidnapping of American generals, the assassination of European industrialists. All of this was part and parcel of KGB operations in Europe. Coincidentally, one of their coordinators in that effort was a young KGB lieutenant colonel operating in Eastern Germany, and his name was Vladimir Putin. Uh, the breakup of the Soviet Union, briefly, back in the last part of the previous century, there might have been an opportunity for Russia to emerge onto the world stage as a co-equal, as a participant, and perhaps with a budding democracy. But we have seen uh, Putin has dominated the political scene, the military scene in Russia, and he is an imperial power. Russia does not want to be our friends. They are not operating in the best interest of anyone except themselves. And that subversion, that those gray zone operations, they continue to this day.
So that's really interesting. Let's talk about that. Your own experience. Where did you come up against Soviet influence or Soviet operations around the world?
Several places. I was also working in Central America, where the Cubans and remarkably the East Germans were very active as military advisors. They were working with guerrilla groups, both the Sandinistas and also rebel groups in places like El Salvador, especially in El Salvador, where there were legitimate grievances to be had. Uh, but under the aegis of Cuban advisors and also East German advisors, all of this tracing back, none of those countries did anything without Soviet/Russian support. The ugly face we saw there was, as Orthodox Marxists, if you were on a bus in El Salvador and it got stopped by the guerrillas, they'd take you out. If your wallet had a voter registration card in it, they would murder you. Those were the stakes of the games in Central America. In Europe, we were operating against a multi-faceted hydra of interlocking terrorist groups who received all of their money, their documents, their training in East Bloc countries, principally East Germany, but also Czechoslovakia as well. Training zones and safe havens for them to cool off in after operations.
So, what was the motivation, though? Why would the Soviet Union and its satellites, such as East Germany or the Czechs or the Bulgarians, why would they be engaged in this sort of behavior? How does it really advance communism to be going and hijacking airplanes or blowing up facilities?
Yeah, it absolutely didn't advance the global cause of Marxism. These were nihilistic, pseudo intellectual murderers. These were psychopaths that were recruited, groomed, and funded by the security services of the Warsaw Pact. And they were turned loose against society. These were some of these operations, for example, would they would go into an airport, open their luggage, pull out assault rifles, and kill as many people as they could at a ticket counter. Uh, they would, during the case of the Achille Lauro hijacking, they shot a man in a wheelchair and threw him over the side of the ship. We were dealing with people who the Soviets and Russians used simply to spread terror and disorganization. That was their purpose. Does that advance the cause of Marxism? No. It was, and this was just the kinetic end of what was going on here. I was, dealing with the hard kinetic aspects of it. The gray zone operations, which ran concurrently, co-opted journalists. Uh, they spread lies in the press, backed up very well that AIDS was a biological weapon created by the United States. All of these things going on. Everything that was new back then, when I was a young SEAL, is all back now. It's all back now. FSB operations in Africa are every bit as violent as they ever were in the jungles of Central America. In fact, they're probably much worse because what's left of the Wagner Group now, they're working as they organize slave labor on behalf of the military dictatorships in, for example, the Central African Republic. Look, this is malevolence. It's poison that's being pumped into the rest of the world. And all of this is happening on Putin's watch and at his behest, right? This isn't something accidental. It's not an accidental byproduct. It's a goal. It's a purpose that Russia has.
So we've discussed before the fact that Russia does align itself with a lot of bad guys, whether it's Iran and North Korea, both state actors, or the non-state actors, as you observed, various terrorist organizations, and even drug cartels. But Russia, everywhere it goes, just seems to sow chaos and create more and more instability. It's a singular objective they have. If Russia cannot have a good time, nobody can have a good time. And they try to pull down the entire world. So, looking at what we see today, though, it is alarming that so many Americans not only are not afraid of this, but they don't recognize the threat that it poses. Russia is not an option. It's not like choosing Coca Cola or Pepsi. Russia is an enemy of the United States. It doesn't want to get closer to America or to NATO. In fact, it wants to destroy both of them. And the faster it can do it, the happier it'll be. So, looking at that and understanding that, how do you make the current situation where there's so many people in America who are now making excuses for Russia, even saying things so outlandish as the fact that Ukraine is responsible for the war starting, or citing things like Ukraine is a country that suppresses freedom of religion. Ukraine is a country that does not have a free press. Totally false. Russian talking points. But now we hear them in the mainstream in America.
We hear them, and in information warfare, the first guy to throw the first false grenade almost wins the battle, right? So it enters the press. Zelensky is a dictator. He hasn't held elections. Okay, well, that resonates in the press until you realize it's in the constitution of Ukraine that you cannot hold an election during wartime. Is that dictatorial? I don't know. Why don't you ask Winston Churchill? He didn't hold an election during wartime. Does that make him a dictator? The United States is probably unique in all of the republics in the world in that Abraham Lincoln did have to hold an election during the American Civil War. It doesn't make sense for Ukraine to violate its own constitution during the middle of this invasion. You know, is Russia, are they the good guys? Are they somehow justified here? Let's look at the means by which Russia addresses problems, right? Two defectors are resident in the United Kingdom. One a former intelligence, two of them former intelligence officers. One of them Putin kills with a radioactive isotope of polonium, which, by the way, was traceable to the exact reactor where it was made. The fingerprint of that, he didn't care. The next guy, the Skripals, they're killed with nerve gas. Again, Russia just absolutely in your face. We're using weapons of mass destruction to police up loose ends politically around the world. That's just the kinetic end of it. We've got election interference that occurred even in the United States. You look at the pressure under which many Eastern European governments are right now, continuing from the Russians, that they're not good players. They have nothing to export but violence and misery. And it's up to us, you and I in the press sometimes, to bring people's attention back to these facts, but it's also inherent on our listeners and our readers. You hear something like that, look into it. The facts are so available to you. You know that Ukraine started this war. I don't know. Did you see the video from the borders when they drove right through the borders? I mean, is that starting the war? I just don't get it.
It's pretty crazy, and it's hard to believe that it's becoming more and more common. It's actually sort of shocking. Listen, Russia has been actively working against Western interest for decades upon decades. And there's little doubt about it. And I do wonder, though, those people consider themselves to be allies of Russia, fellow travelers per se. Do they expect that once Russia has some sort of a deal with the West, say the US or Europe, that they will then have a ton of new opportunities? History though shows that Russia uses these sorts of people. Well, it uses them. Once that Russia does come to power, it gets rid of them because it doesn't trust them either. Russia doesn't trust people who betray their own country, ironically enough. So even these people who think that they're doing a great move or a strategic gesture to try to align with Russia don't realize in the long term they're definitely going to lose out.
Well, and there's another set of facts that need to be uh, discerned and underlined a little bit better. Uh, Russia is not winning this war. They are never going to win this war. They continue to lose about 1,500 people a day. In military terms, that's about a battalion every day that they lose, right? They're not advancing. Sure, they have made some advances over 2024. They captured the equivalent of Los Angeles County, right? They lost 490,000 men doing it. They lost 10,000 main battle tanks, which is 17 times the number of tanks owned by all of NATO. That isn't winning. And I almost said the Soviet Union. Russia is weaker now militarily than it has been since the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. They are weaker militarily. You can't sustain those kinds of losses. Here's the other thing. It isn't Ukraine that needs the peace deal. It's Russia. It's Russia.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Chuck. But wouldn't you agree that Russia sees this? I mean, the senior leadership of Moscow must realize the war in Ukraine, it's not going anywhere. They've been stuck in a quagmire that just gets worse and worse by the day. And I think that's exactly why they're doubling down on trying to do things using the shadow wars, trying to use their spies, their intelligence services to do sabotage, as well as arson, as well as assassinations, as well as meddling in elections. Because what better way to change the outcome than simply take your opponents off the board? If you can get a government elected that does not view Russia to be a threat, that's the best thing that can happen. That's a huge relief, and that's a lot cheaper than having a hot war. What do you think about that?
Well, there's no doubt about it. It is always better to achieve things behind the scenes. You want to avoid a kinetic conflict wherever possible. There was something during the days of the Soviet Union. We knew that the mainspring, the ideological mainspring of the Soviet actions was Marxism. We all became, at way back at that time, scholars of Marxism. We read everything, Das Kapital, the Grundrisse, the entire thing. And inherent in Marxism was this seed of conspiracy, baked in by Marx himself, telling you to set up cellular organizations, etc. That injection, that ethos never left the Russians, and especially the Slovaki. It never left them. You have got the last Homo Sovieticus, Vladimir Putin, in charge of the country. It's baked into his brain. Gray zone operations, obtuse means of influencing other governments, sabotage, which we see continuing to this day. Yesterday, there was another Baltic cable sabotage. Look, there we go, spreading chaos, it's spreading as much terror and spewing as many disadvantageous circumstances as possible. Russia always does well in the gray zone. They they're the masters at it. But the paper tiger that is the Russian military, we're seeing it writ large in Ukraine. We have to keep that in front of our eyes here. Russia does not have a military solution in Ukraine. It isn't going to happen. We've got to enter these negotiations or head them and encourage our leaders to recognize that fact. It's Putin who needs the break, who needs the ceasefire. And we have to always remember what happens when he gets it. He rearms and he's going to come back and take another bite at the apple. Chechnya, Georgia, Moldova, we've seen it again and again.
Certainly the case. So at this point, what do you suggest that the U.S. be doing?
You know what? It's a little bit like those a Western. You walk into the poker table and the bad guys on the other side. The first thing you do is put your pistol on the table and let them know that, look, you're serious. If you are serious about stopping this war, and let's say you don't want the war to continue anymore, you don't want any more killing, bombing, bloodshed. Maybe you don't want to watch Russian ballistic missiles slam into cities every single night. Okay, one thing you can say to Vladimir Putin is you've got this shadow fleet of tankers. They're all more than 20 years old. They don't have well-trained crews on them. They seem to be dragging their anchors wherever they go. From now on, every time a ship comes through the Baltic that's going to do business with Russia, it's going to have to be convoyed by NATO vessels. We'll get 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 200 of them together at a time, and we'll let them go into your ports. And in the meantime, we're going to interdict every one of these tankers around the world with the United States Navy, and we're going to force them into compliance, both with the sanctions and with the environmental imperatives, because there will be a big act. It's going to happen. It's already happened. Look at the Azov Sea. Two Russian oil tankers broke in half and polluted the Azov Sea. We've got to get serious about forcing Russia into stopping the aggression. And the other thing, look, I'm one of those guys who wants to see this return to the status quo antebellum, the way it was 12 years ago. Ukraine's borders secure in their sovereignty and in their totality.
So, Chuck, let me ask you a totally unrelated question, but it does come to mind. The Russian military is obviously a disaster, and it's very hard to tell what's going on internally. But as a guy who was a Navy SEAL, what do you make of the Russian special forces? And how are they different than American special forces? I mean, the Russians put out a lot of videos. They show they're very tough, but are they so tough? What are they really about? Are they trained to do the same level of significant attacks that somebody trained by the US military can do?
The quality of your special forces is all related essentially to money, right? So Navy SEALs are so good because their training is extremely comprehensive and that costs money, right? So they can do high altitude parachuting, they can do diving, they can do underwater demolitions, they can control direct action missions in any environment, ocean, sea, glacier, jungle. They can carry out overt military operations. They can carry out clandestine military operations. There were some very capable Russian special operations forces in the beginning of the war. There are still some very dangerous and capable Russian military units, more on the covert, not overt side. But right now, Russia doesn't have any special operations capability because they use these special operations forces as cannon fodder, as firemen. For example, in the Battle of Bakhmut, they fed battalions of their best special operations forces into the fight as riflemen. So you try to imagine a guy that you have trained in underwater demolition, high altitude parachuting, how to run a clandestine network behind enemy lines, and you have him fix his bayonet and run at a Ukrainian machine gun nest. That's good for us because they've burned through their Spetsnaz, they've burned through their naval infantry, they've burned through their paratroopers. And what international special operations capability they still have, these are people who are close to Putin in the Kremlin. They're still dangerous because they're not constrained by any morality in from the Kremlin. They are sent to do jobs like pour nerve gas on somebody's doorknob, and they have to be watched. And there are active assassination plots underway right now in Europe, as also sabotage and ongoing special operations forces, FSB, alpha units conducting reconnaissance against industrial targets throughout Europe. Watch out Norway, watch out Sweden, watch out UK.
So the kinetic side is, well, quite kinetic. It seems that there's a lot going on.
Yeah, but that is generally the tip of the iceberg. And, as far as NATO operations go, the tip of the iceberg is not really where you want to be. Most stuff is going on below the surface, clandestine and covert operations. The money shot is, however, political warfare. And that's your expertise. That's your wheelhouse. And I'd love to hear a summary.
So I think that Russia is correct. It knows that it can invest for very, very little to create huge change in multiple countries. And we've seen that around the world, not just recently, but in the past few decades, it's always been the same. They show up with bags of cash, and it's amazing how many new friends they can find. They could sponsor all sorts of organizations, whether those things are de facto, like advanced persistent threats today in hacking, are those groups, such as the ones you mentioned, that just go and create mayhem, go and blow things up. It just destabilizes the situation, creates problems, creates tension, but it doesn't really create political change. But then they have the ones that they're really interested in. For instance, they might have a journalist who they pay to always have a skew. He won't come out and say, I support Russia, but he calls into question whenever he can what's going on with Ukraine. Does Ukraine have Nazis? And writing articles that would just be trying to do as much as he can to pull down Ukraine, which de facto pushes up Russia. Then we look on the political side, though. We see the direct support for different regimes. As you observed, in the Soviet period, having military advisors was always a tactic the Russians had. And today we see the same thing. We see that Wagner Group is being used throughout Africa. It also advises governments, such as the one in Venezuela. We see that they help other countries to launder money. Countries like North Korea, countries like Venezuela and Iran that have sanctions don't have easy access to money. But you know what? Russian banks are happy to wash the money. More than that, who are they dealing with? Well, we see that they work with groups such as drug cartels. But why drug cartels? It's not for mutual love, it's simple mutual interest. One side has a lot of dirty money, the other side has banks that can wash it. And the Russians are well enough aware that those cartels are not very good for the US. In the same way, it realizes that the illegal immigration showing up in the US, specifically from countries where Russia has high influence before elections, is something that helps. And don't doubt it's just the US. We saw the exact same thing happen now multiple times in Europe. We remember how they had the immigration crisis right before the war began in Ukraine on the Belarusian border with Lithuania as well as with Poland, essentially turning refugees into weapons. But this is part of Russia's global strategy. And they are sponsoring, but we've talked about many times, incredible amounts of propaganda and disinformation, just incredible sums of it. There's no way to get to the bottom of it. There's so much. But it doesn't end there. They are taking an active role in trying to pervert democracies in other countries that are functioning correctly and trying to create civil strife. And I think that's something that usually people get wrong when they understand how Russia operates. It's not that they will come out and support always the left or the right. They have an interest in supporting both sides, or either side, or whichever side will create more tension. So it's totally possible to be supporting on one side environmentalists and gun rights owners at the same time. Why? Well, because you know what? They're going to create problems within their own society and create more tensions. Anti-nuclear energy, that's a great cause to support. Let's get behind that. You know why? It creates dependency on Russia. This is all stuff that Russia does. It is calculated. It does not happen by chance. And if we look at it, I know many people probably think it sounds like a conspiracy, but it is. It is actually a conspiracy by definition of the word. Russia around the world is trying to do what it can to pull strings to have a shadow war against the West, to destabilize us in the fight against our interest. And when we look at what's going on now, especially in the US, it's alarming to see how often we hear these talking points that are so close to Russia being repeated by people who are in serious positions. It's a sign that Russia is having much more of a impact than we would have ever hoped.
Yeah, it is definitely the case. I was glad you pointed out that the Russians will play polar opposites against each other. What's important for them is the frisson, is the fight, is the schisms. Famously, it was Che Guevara who wrote a letter to his Cuban benefactors during his time in Bolivia, and he was asking for them to raise money. But the other thing he said, his last missive to them was lean on the schisms, right? Turn the people who are against me, turn them against each other. That is one of the, we talk about American soft power. Let's talk about Russian soft power. This is really their primary weapon. It is a weapon that not very many American people even understand, even as they see racist comments being dropped into their social media. It just doesn't occur to them that this could be a Russian bot farm. All they want to do is elicit these responses out of you. They want chaos. They want you to join in this fight. They want you to respond. And they are, look, nobody does it better. That they did it terrifically during the times of the Soviet Union. Now with social media, one person sitting in their mother's basement can reach out to the entire world. But some of those people are nefarious operators. And the Internet Research Administration there in Russia, they are masters of it. This is what their job is every day. And it does influence the discourse and it influences how people think. And unfortunately, Jason, some of those people are at the top. And that's alarming.
It's very alarming and it's very worrisome what will come next. But at this point, I think that Russia is watching the situation as carefully as we are. The fact is, they know that on the battlefield, they have nowhere to go. They need the negotiations. And so they're going to pull out all the stops at this point to see if they can put pressure on those who already might have had sympathies for Russia or simply didn't like Ukraine or didn't care about it in order to tilt the game board in their favor. So I think the upcoming few weeks are going to be tremendously important.
Absolutely. And going into these negotiations, it is going to be imperative for Russia to somehow appeal to the better angels of the nature of the Western people. Somehow make it look like the victim somehow deserved it. Ukraine brought this on. Ukraine forced us to invade. They forced us to bomb their cities. When you look at it that way, it sounds so absolutely preposterous. You laugh. But look what's going on right now. Look what's going on. Russia needs to vilify the victim, and they're going to try their best. They're not going to get away with it on our watch, folks.
That's absolutely the case. Chuck, great talking with you as always.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for having me.